I have a very unique background. I spent 24 years of my life in healthcare. Started off selling after high school biology, teacher and coach of football and track. I got into the medical sales world because one of my student athletes' dad said, hey, right? And then all of a sudden I started working for Pfizer. Went through the chain, lots of work in laboratories, selling capital equipment to microbiology, mainframe clinical chemistry, pathology, director of sales of a biotech company, all worked in the open heart surgery arena during open heart surgery, right? So very unique perspective on microbial contamination, infectious disease, decontamination, and disinfecting and cleaning, the world of mold, mold remediation, mold abatement is a lot different today than it was 1, 2, or 3 decades ago. Most people think of mold, they see that black stuff growing on a wall. Well, the reality today is there's a very good portion of the population that suffers from mold. They're mold sensitized. They could be a SIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome sufferer, or diagnosed as such, and you don't even have to see mold, right? So mold today is really a indoor air quality contaminant, all right? And you'll see some stuff in here in the presentation, some words, terminologies, bioaerosol, right? So it's about indoor air quality. What's the relationship here? I talk about mold, right? Mold, RAM restoration, mold, extreme microbial technology, reduce mold spores. Well, there's an interrelationship here. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in a water-damaged environment that goes beyond mold. We have, in this case, this is a water-damaged building, but the biocontaminant, bio meaning microbial, interaction. So it's not just mold species specifically, or marker molds. You have mycotoxin production, you have volatile organic compounds, you have microbial volatile organic compounds, the stuff that these things give off, beta-glucans, and then bacteria, right? Stuff that comes off of the outer membrane of bacteria that also gets aerosolized, that you therefore inhale, that also can make you sick. It doesn't have to be a mold spore. We breathe 20,000 times a day. That's 18 cubic feet of air, 440 cubic feet of air daily. We spend 90% of our times indoors, and we're always doing this. So what you breathe matters, right? Yet, the symptoms of mold exposure are increasing. I'll talk about that momentarily. And the rate of aerosolized transmissible diseases have hardly been affected over decades. So where's the disconnect? One of the things that I marvel about in my life is someday somebody wakes up and goes, I wonder, in this case, how many spores are released into the atmosphere with normal airspeed in an indoor environment. Who thinks of that stuff, right? So in this particular research paper, and we've known this, by the way, since the early 2000s, that's 2 decades old data. So these researchers are citing studies that were done based on 1 square centimeter in a bench test. 1 square centimeter, basically your fingernail, okay? Low air speeds, I'm walking through my environment. Just walking. I have maybe a leak underneath that I never detected, this mold growing in the back of the cabinet. I open up the cabinet. Airspeed change, the differential from the air pressure from the outside to the inside of the cabinet. You open up that cabinet, things get launched into the atmosphere, okay? Tested 3 different species of mold. Cladosporium, under 500 spores. Like that. From that much surface area. Stachybotrys, 4,000. Aspergillus penicillium, 10,000. Just from walking, right? Something's growing there. That's enough to pull it off of wherever it's at. So basically, it's like that dandelion when you were a kid. A little bit of air, gone. Where's it go? Into the air. If it was on the surface, it goes into the air, you breathe it, and lands back on the surface, and you're on the gerbil cage. Airspeed, normal foot traffic, normal everything constantly gets cycled into that environment. Okay? Now you can denature them, but you have to remove them. Sick building syndrome, building-related illness. How many people have heard of that? Okay. Sick building syndrome, I walk into a building. Within a couple of minutes, I'm starting to go, my eyes are, right? Boy, my hands are starting to hurt. I'm coughing, right? Something's in there. You've breathed in, within a short period of time, your immune system, because your DNA has something that's either missing or is not working properly, and you start to react. When you leave the building, it's like, oh wow, my hands feel better again. I'm not coughing. My eyes aren't watering. Building-related illness, different story. You go to work, you're in the building, you're there constantly, every day, whatever the case may be, and all of a sudden you get more of a disease like Legionnaires. It's a different type of an illness. Healthcare practitioners are becoming more and more familiar with the health issues, specifically with mold. I mentioned 30% of the population is suffering from mold. Dr. Neil Nathan has a quote on that. I'll read it momentarily, and here it is. So in the 70s and 80s, NIOSH, National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, did a study on 500 buildings. They said those 500 buildings, 5% of them are contaminated with microbials. That's bacteria, virus, fungal spores, yeasts, right? A decade later, by the 1990s, that's almost 50% of the buildings. Something's going on here. What's going on? Today, the EPA, we spend 90% of our time indoors, right? Everybody knows that. That's a very common number. Most human beings today are spending their times indoors. Dr. Neil Nathan, I had the pleasure of sitting through one of his presentations a couple of years ago, one of the foremost leading authorities on mold-related illnesses. That book is my Bible. I refer it to to clients all the time that are mold sensitized back in California. It gives a tremendous overview of why you're sick. He states there are millions of people suffering from mold toxicity that don't know it because it's going majorly undiagnosed. These illnesses are increasing, and if we don't grasp this, take it seriously, monitor our own exposure, all of us are going to be sick. Okay? Dose response, duration, you've got two subsets, right? If you're somebody who has a genetic predisposition, then you're immediately susceptible. If you're not, depending upon what the toxin is and how long you're in that environment, you'll get a reaction. I am not a mold sensitized person. I go into a building, I'm doing inspections, I'm watching my technicians, I'm talking to the client, I'm doing a BAMS reading, which will come in one of the other sections, talking to them about what we're finding, and all of a sudden I get a reaction. So even though you're not mold sensitized, you still can have a reaction. It's dose, response, duration. Here's a big one. Relative size of particles. What are we talking about? Well, here's a human hair. About 180 microns, right? Mine's not as thick anymore given my age. When I was younger, it was maybe 180 microns. It's not today. Most of the stuff that we deal with is 2.5 microns and below. As it relates to that particle size and its effect on your health. And there's a reason for it, because the smaller the particle, the more immediate track it gets into your bloodstream. We'll cover that momentarily. I cite this paper all the time. It's one of the things I reference when I'm talking to clients. Dr. William Nazaroff, Cal Berkeley, published in Indoor Air back in 2011. He concluded that bioaerosol behavior, again, bio, microbial, aerosolized in the air, the biologics that are in the air, right, between 0.1 to 10 micron in aerodynamic diameter, the size, has a direct effect. So here's what happens. This is what this paper talks about. A human being in a toxic environment is breathing, right, one of those 18,000 cubic feet of air a day. A 2 micron particle goes through your nose, goes into your mouth, through the cilia, down your bronchial tubes, into the alveoli of your lungs, and into your bloodstream, like that. If you're part of that 30%, if you have a genetic predisposition or you're part of the 30%, if you're immunocompromised, that particle goes right into your bloodstream. Your DNA starts going ding, or your immune system goes ding, 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 and you're immediately affected. Is it hazardous to health? Yeah, lots of studies. World Health Organization, say what you want about them, but they look at data globally. There is no standard in the United States. EPA, CDC, no one is saying what is an acceptable amount of air in an indoor environment relative to spore counts, right? What's a healthy amount? No one says it. World Health Organization says the following: 500 colony-forming units per cubic meter of air is a risk. It's considered hazardous. 500. 1,000 is extremely hazardous. They're not differentiating between, are you a mold sensitized person? You're saying for a human being. Now, we measure mold spores in an air spore. Hey, Randy. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming in today. The difference between cubic colony forming units and cubic meter of air is the viability. So if we get a spore trap air sample that has 500 spores per cubic meter of air, the CFU would be, do they grow? Are they viable? That's the difference, right? Okay. A lot of people don't know this, but although you get sporulation, and mold grows in exists in one of three states. It's dormant, it's active, or it's been denatured. No longer capable of respiration, right? But during the cycle, its life cycle, people think, well, you get a mold spore, it goes off into the atmosphere, you get that little round, tiny, tiny little dot or bubble, right? And that's all it is. Wrong. Hundreds of times more than just the spore itself, the particles and fragments of the mold are also in the air. And that can make you sick. You know, there's this notion out there that even dead mold can make you sick. That's not true. Dead mold can't. But the allergens and toxins and toxigenic, such as mycotoxins, that it produces while it is alive and respirating, that's what makes you sick. And every bit of fragment, like 270 times higher for penicillin, meaning fragments of that, hyphal fragments, components of that cell membrane, they could have mycotoxins on it, right? That's what makes you sick. It's not the dead mold. So we got a lot of educating to do out there. Additionally, Stachybotrys, toxic black mold, produces mycotoxins that are really bad. This particular species was done, I think it was the Cleveland study back in the late 90s, associated with idiopathic pulmonary hemorrhage in children in the United States. In Cleveland, there were like 9 children, babies, toddlers, infants that died within a very short period of time, all within a 6-mile radius. Researchers go in there and find every one of those buildings were significantly water damaged, right? And the deduction was that it was Stachybotrys. More and more and more literature. I'm inundating you with stuff that you don't even need to read. I'm just going to tell you about it, right? Published behavioral brain research. So I don't care if it's indoor toxicology. I don't care if it's behavioral brain research. I don't care if it's indoor microbiology. It doesn't matter what the publication is. These are peer-reviewed, highly reproducible, confirmatory evidence. In this case, compelling evidence that mold exposure causes serious multisystem health problems in humans. Multisystem means multiple organs. Liver, kidney, eyes, brain, lung. Not just one thing. Kilburn study. Increased reaction time, visual anomalies, decreased grip strength, balance, peripheral neuropathy, as well as cognitive, all right? Shoemaker, the foremost leading authority. He's the guy who started this thing. Doctor in Maryland, no longer practicing, wakes up and goes, you know what, these patients that I'm seeing, they're sick, and it's not VOCs. And it's not Lyme's disease, even though it looks like it. He starts drilling into it. The rest of his life, he's trying to solve a problem, and he did. said this is called CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. But he found changes in blood inflammatory markers in mold-exposed patients were correlated with significant structural differences in 6 of 11 brain areas. Brain. Okay? Now, one of the other things that drills into this is some of the mycotoxins produced by certain molds cross the blood-brain barrier. So if you inhale a mycotoxin, it doesn't just sit in your lung. It doesn't just go into your bloodstream. It goes into your bloodstream, goes right past the blood-brain barrier in your brain and affects your brain. Like that. Why do people get sick? Don't look at the... No. I'm going to simplify it. I put it up there because this is how they teach doctors, right? I couldn't find one that had the cytokine histamine intolerance and mast cell activation slide. Histamine intolerance and mast cell activation, that's what happens. So if I go back to this, hits the alveoli, goes right into the bloodstream. Within seconds, somebody's not feeling well because their immune system isn't working right. And we now know that people are missing an HLA-DR gene, or it's not functioning properly. Histamine, when you guys get a cold, October, November, December, January, February out here, achoo, achoo. Where do you go and what do you buy? The drugstore, antihistamine, right? And you take it and all of a sudden your eyes stop watering, you stop coughing, and at least you can tolerate the misery, right? For these people, it doesn't shut off. It's consistent, it's constant. That's the first problem. Second thing, mast cell activation, which is a whole nother pathway that's very, very complicated. These people get adversely affected and it becomes a major, major, major problem. It's a very complex. I just wanted to tell you that it's not a simple thing. If you're mold sensitized, you become contaminated. It takes a long time to get better if you ever can get better, and that's why it's so important to do everything right. Because if you leave something in an environment and it's not done correctly, that person can't get better. I mentioned Environmental Brain Health Clinic of America. They're referring people out. They now know, environmental medical people know that it's environmental related. The environment is the source of the illness. Identify the environment, identify the source within the environment, fix it, and then decontaminate it comprehensively to give that occupant, which is 3 out of every 10 people minimally. Dr. Nathan thinks it's maybe 50%, right? So right here, everybody on this side, you're mold sensitized, you don't know it. Everybody on this side, you're okay for now. That's a lot of people. The reality is, and we deal with a lot of these folks and have been since I started the business, long before I met the esteemed Mr. Hoffman over there talking about this stuff. These people are at the end of their rope. The degree of depression, the degree of physical discomfort, the degree of anxiety, the degree of physical illness and fatigue is extraordinary. And in almost all cases, when I meet with Mr. and Mrs., and the Mrs. is sensitized or the Mr. is, let me guess, in the early days you were saying, she's crazy. Yep. In the early days you were saying, he's crazy. Yep. Where are you now? It's not. It's a real thing. Okay? It's hard for us to understand and comprehend this because you can't see it. You just can't see it. How can you be in so much pain? You didn't crash your car into a telephone pole. You breathed something. Mycotoxins comes from the Greek fungus and toxin and poison, right? So it's a poisonous fungus. Mycotoxins produced in mold-related water-damaged buildings. Earmark study. Water-damaged building, right? Remember, thrasher. If the indoor species count is higher than the outside, you should automatically deduce that it's contaminated. Well, here's the next deduction. You get a water-damaged building, you don't have to think. You don't have to say might. You don't have to say could have mycotoxins. You got mycotoxins. Period, end of story. Dr. Erika Blom, Lund University in Sweden, another one of these geniuses that wakes up and goes, I think I need to test for how many mycotoxins are in water-damaged buildings in surface sampling. How do these people think about this stuff? I don't know, but I'm glad they did. So, Dr. Blum goes into a water-damaged building in Sweden and tests 98 building samples. 79 were positive for at least one mycotoxin. That's 80% of the samples in a water-damaged building. It's automatic. You have mycotoxin productivity. Why is that important? Number one, it's more toxigenic. And I'll get into that, I think, in section 2. Why mycotoxins are important and why it's a hot topic today. But those were air samples, by the way, and then almost 50% of the settled dust samples tested positive. So it was in the air. Mycotoxins is a strange animal. It doesn't have a physical structure. It's a chemical. It's a very sticky chemical. So if you go in there with EMT technology, you go in there and you do your abatement, you're spraying with a chemical, you're doing this, you're wiping, you're sandblasting, you're dry ice, whatever the method of choice is, depending upon what you're dealing with. You're probably still not removing the mycotoxins from the environment, and therefore sanitation cleaning is critical. Critical, 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 critical. It has to be physically removed. We'll get into that. Various species produce various mycotoxins which produce various diseases. That's all you need to know. Alzheimer's patient, Dr. Neil Nathan, 2 years ago, stunned the audience when he said, today, 20% of all Alzheimer's patients are classified as atypical Alzheimer's. And the reason for it is mold contamination, mold exposure, and these are the 3 words that got me. And it's treatable. So the people out there that are suffering with a family member who has Alzheimer's because of mold exposure, it's treatable. How long were they suffering? Is this important for us to know? Yep. Does the world know this? Nope. Should they know it? Yep. Are we on a mission? Yep. What's the mission? Tell people what we now know so that we can help our fellow human beings. What's the cause of all this? Water-damaged buildings. You will not have mold if you don't have water. When you have water problems, you have mold. You can go into a building that never had a water damage entity or event, and it will not be moldy. You go into a brand new house whose water heater leaked 10 days ago. You got mold. It's cuckoo crazy. Water equals mold, mold equals water.